Hello, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I'm your host for this podcast. And welcome to episode 2. Now, this episode is brought to you on a dark and stormy night, so if you hear thunder in the background, it's because we're having a relatively major thunderstorm. But hopefully, all will remain well, and we won't lose power. But this episode is going to focus on medieval Dublin. Now, I was honored to participate in the Irish Conference of Medievalists at Trinity College in Dublin. And of course, Trinity is my alma mater. I went to Florida State as an undergraduate, and I did my final year of undergraduate as an international student at Trinity College in Dublin. And then I stayed to do my master's and my PhD there at Trinity. Now, I returned to the United States to get a job, but in many respects, even though I'm an American, Dublin really is still home. So when I landed, I got out of the plane, I got out of the airport, and I just got this wonderful, reassuring sense when I smelled that fresh air by the airport that I was home. Now, my people are here in the States, by and large. I have a lot of people still in Ireland, and I am delighted to have this chance to bring you the highlights of my favorite parts of medieval Dublin. Now, there are a lot of places I didn't get a chance to go, and I got video in some places, and so you'll have the chance during this podcast to see some of those videos, and of course, I'll be posting some outtakes and some additional video on my Patreon site and my Substack, as well as on my YouTube site for subscribers. But overall, I'm hoping to give all of you a chance to glimpse the medieval Dublin that I love dearly. As I said, there are a lot of places I didn't get a chance to film, and a few of my old haunts I didn't get to actually haunt. But I will be talking about medieval Dublin in the broadest possible terms for this episode. Next episode, we'll have a guest, but more about that later. So today, I want to focus on medieval Dublin. Now, first of all, in the first episode, I talked about essentially what makes the Middle Ages. Now, Ireland as a country, as an island nation, is one that has experienced a series of invasions and settlements. And really, honestly, medieval Dublin is a cosmopolitan city, even in the Middle Ages. Now, an awful lot of people, particularly Irish Americans, have a very definitive idea of what Ireland looks like. St. Patrick's Day, comely maidens dancing at the crossroads. We have Eamon de Valera to thank for that. And this kind of idyllic idea of Dublin or even Ireland as somehow very pastoral, very rural, thatched roof cottages. And there is some of that in Ireland. Ireland retains an awful lot of its older charm. Dublin, as its capital city, however, is both old and new, future and past. Dublin is one of those cities that retains a lot of its medieval aspects, a lot of its medieval buildings, its character, its flavor, but also has the modern, vibrant European feeling. It's a major city. You're going to find light rail and public transportation. You're going to find green spaces and restaurants from all the different groups of people who call Ireland their home now. You will be able to get a curry. You'll be able to get Chinese food. You'll be able to get Mexican food, Japanese food, but also traditional Irish fare. Dublin is a truly cosmopolitan city. In many ways, it's the best of all of the different worlds, and it's changed an awful lot since even I lived there. Now, of course, every time I go back to Dublin, I explore something new. And Dublin is one of those places that at the same time, it can feel both completely and exactly the same and totally different. So when I landed in Dublin, I took a walk. I walked all my old haunts. I used to live down by Fitzwilliam Square off of Baggot Street. And if you're familiar with Dublin, you know that some of the more famous pubs are down in that end of Dublin, in Dublin too. And I was able to see how many changes Dublin has undergone since the last time I was there, which was 2017. Now, I graduated in 2000, so I left Dublin 25 years ago. That said, I've been back repeatedly over the years. And parts of medieval Dublin now are preserved even more, largely because the Irish government and the Irish people recognize how important it is to preserve the real, true history of Ireland. So let's start with kind of an overview of medieval Dublin. First of all, Dublin itself was founded not by Irish, but by Vikings. Now, when I say Vikings, I'm sure several of you have in your head the image of Vikings or the Minnesota football team or horrible, bloodthirsty, ravaging raiders with their helmets and horns. Viking is actually a title. It's a part-time summer job. Vikinga in Old Norse Icelandic means bay raider. It is somebody who goes out during the summer months or occasionally through the course of the actual year and raids. They go on excursions, raiding places that have loot, raiding places that have money, but they don't just loot. This idea that the Vikings are simply all about rape, pillage, and burn. And by the way, you have to do it in that order. You have to rape, pillage, and then burn, because if you burn first, everything's a little gooey and it's a bit gross. And if you pillage first, your hands are full. Makes everything else kind of difficult. That said, not to make light of sexual assault, because I'm not. The idea of Vikings as just simply a people who rape, pillage, and burn, who kill their enemies, who engage in bloodthirsty tactics, is erroneous. I promise you, we will have another episode on Vikings. I have done an awful lot of work on Old Norse Icelandic literature and culture, and I have several colleagues who specialize in different aspects of Viking culture, and I will bring them to you. But for our purposes today, it's important to point out that the Vikings were not simply barbaric, ruthless, bloodthirsty barbarians, because they settled in addition to plundering. They found good places for farming and for fishing, for cultivating their crops. And Ireland has an awful lot of very fertile land, and the Vikings recognized this. So in fact, the Vikings settled every major city in Ireland. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, those are all Viking settlements. Dublin specifically was founded by Vikings or settled by Vikings who built their long fort. A long fort means a ship harbor. And they built that ship's harbor on the edge of the River Liffey. Now, they built that long fort at a point where the River Liffey comes into the River Poddle. And those two rivers came together and formed a black pool. And so the Vikings named their city, or named their settlement, Dublin, which is actually an Irish word for black pool. Well, why on earth would Vikings use an Irish term for their settlement? Well, before the Vikings set up their long fort in about 841-ish CE, that's that very scientific-ish designation there, because it was about 841. Before the Vikings established their own long fort there was a settlement set up by the Gaels. And the Gaels are the original Irish people who lived in that area. For the purposes here, we will refer to them as the native Irish. Now, the Gaels set up on the River Liffey about the 7th century. So maybe about 100 years or maybe about 50 years before the Vikings established their long fort. Now, they called that settlement Ballia. And of course, Ballia means town of the hurdled ford. And if you're thinking, what on earth does that mean? Town of the hurdled ford means a town next to a river where you have several places to cross that river. A ford is an area of land that generally is built up to cross a river that is tidal. So when the river recedes because the tide is out, then you can cross the ford and cross the river. Once the tide comes in, you're out of luck and you might be isolated. Now, of course, there are several bridges that have since been built over the River Liffey. And in fact, there may well have been earlier bridges in that early medieval period. If you stand on O'Connell Street Bridge today and you look either side down the River Liffey, you will see a number of different bridges to cross from the south side of the city to the north side of the city. Now, the Gaels who established that settlement also had a monastery because Christianity came to Ireland fairly early. And so it would be an ideal spot for Vikings. Not just to plunder, though, because you can't exactly live next to the people you've just robbed or potentially killed, possibly. So they set up a trading site. The Long Fort was not just a base from which they could run their trading and their raiding operations, but it was a full settlement. And as I explained in my short reel, the archaeology of that settlement survives, sort of. In the 1970s and 80s, as modern Dublin was evolving and the Irish corporation, the Dublin Corporation, which is the city government, the Dublin Corporation was digging up foundations for its new corporation buildings. These are very sleek, modern buildings, and in and of themselves, they're not that bad looking. They're quite aesthetically pleasing to an extent. Except, of course, the standard joke is that there are two ugly buildings in Dublin. The ugliest is the one behind Christ Church. The second ugliest is the one built on the grounds of Dublin Castle. And I'll return to that one in a second. But the ugliest building in Dublin isn't ugly in and of itself. It's called that because when they were digging those foundations between 1974 and 1981, they made a huge archaeological find, a massive Viking settlement. This was the Long Fort. This was the actual settlement that was attached to that ship's harbor that was established in the 9th century. And they found longhouses, they found domestic goods, they found evidence of trading, they found all kinds of important artifacts. And as I said in my short reel, they had two choices. Pick up everything they could find, take lots of pictures, kind of get a sense of what was where, and then pour concrete on it and build the building anyway. Well, their other option would have been to keep it open as an archaeological site. And of course, that would have cost money, and it would have cost time, and it would have slowed up the development of modern Dublin. So they poured concrete on it. But they picked up everything they could carry first. And they did do extensive excavations. They were very careful in making sure that they could record as much of the archaeology as possible without leaving it an open archaeological site. Now that is right next to Christ Church Cathedral. And I'll talk about Christ Church Cathedral in a minute because it's actually a really significant part of medieval Dublin. So when we're talking about medieval Dublin, we're talking about a settlement that starts with the Gaels in the 7th century, Baile Clia. Then we're talking about the Vikings, that would be those summer raiders who decided to set up shop and tannery and brewery and basically homes and establish a massive town with their Long Fort in about 841. After that, the city thrives. And it's important to understand that in this period, in the 9th century, you have Scandinavian Vikings, who, as I said, are not just your bloodthirsty barbarians with the horns on their helmets. By the way, if I didn't mention it earlier, they didn't have horns on their helmets. There is no archaeological evidence to support the idea that Vikings had horns on their helmets. That is probably a 19th century invention. Thank you, Wagner, with his operas. In fact, if you think about it, having horns on your helmet would be incredibly impractical because somebody can grab those horns and pull your helmet off or pull you over a shield wall. Or if you're in a shield wall and you're right next to the guy next to you, you'd put their eye out. It's kind of dangerous. They're terribly impractical. If there were horns on helmets, and again, there's no evidence that there ever was, if there were horns on helmets, then they were ceremonial only and for burial. But like I said, we'll get into Vikings on another episode. I promise. For now, though, Viking Dublin is a thriving, bustling place, but there's an awful lot of alliances and contact with the Gaels, with the Irish. You have intermarriage, you have people who trade, people who work together. You have the Christian monasteries that take both Gael and Scandinavian. The Scandinavians themselves are by and large not Christian. They are polytheistic. They follow the gods Odin and Thor and Freya and Frigga, Loki, all of those guys. But you get an awful lot of blending of syncretic traditions where the different religious ideas kind of synthesize and come together. So Irish Christianity develops into something very unique. And you see that in a lot of the early Christian sites around Ireland. One of my favorite sites, and I wish I had had time to go this time, and maybe I'll have a chance to go back and take some videos for all of you and present my view of Glendalough. Now, St. Kevin's Monastery in Glendalough is an early Christian monastery, notable for its surviving stone buildings and round tower. And it is called Glen of the Two Lakes, and it is unequivocally one of the most beautiful places in Ireland. And it is one of my favorite places in Ireland. And because Glendalough is in County Wicklow and is about an hour south of Dublin, just past the Wicklow Mountains, you can stop at Johnny Fox's on your way, which is reputed to be the highest pub in Ireland. And they're really good for traditional sessions, traditional music, traditional just food and everything, and their seafood is divine. Stop at Johnny Fox's on your way to Glendalough. But if you go to Glendalough, you can really get a sense of what Irish monastic life might have been like in the 10th century. But because it's so close to Dublin, there's a lot of contact between Wicklow and Dublin. And in fact, when we go into Christ Church and we talk about some of the artifacts there, you will see that there's a pronounced connection between Glendalough and Dublin. But medieval Dublin is a bustling city. It is a city with traders. It's got the long fort. You've got a lot of ship traffic. And one of the important things to understand about the Vikings, but also the Gaels in Dublin, is that they didn't just stay there. They went everywhere. Vikings explored, but not all Vikings were Scandinavian, and not all Scandinavians were Vikings. In fact, the Scandinavian Vikings, that misnomer, is certainly a thing, and the word itself is Scandinavian. But you have Gaels who went with them, who joined up and went on expeditions, and those Viking expeditions by the height of the Middle Ages, extend all the way around the Mediterranean, North Africa, Sicily, the Iberian Peninsula, Constantinople. In fact, there are Vikings who formed the Varangian Guards and guard the gates of Constantinople by the 13th century. So this idea that Vikings are all Scandinavians and thus all white is actually incorrect. We have archaeological and DNA evidence that suggests that there was quite a lot of mixing, quite a lot of picking people up along the way that happened with the Vikings. And it's no different from medieval Dublin. You have the Gaels, you have the Scandinavians, but they intermarried, they intermixed, and eventually, of course, they formed their own alliances. An important example of that Irish and Viking alliance is the Battle of Clontarf, which was April 23rd, 1014. Now, the Battle of Clontarf essentially pitted the army of Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, who was based at Tara, against a Norse-Irish alliance that included the forces of Sigtryg Silkbeard, who was the King of Dublin, Maelmorda MacMurta, the King of Leinster, and then a Viking army led by Sigurd of Orkney and Brother of the Isle of Man. Now, Brother, of course, was an apostate. He was a Christian who went back to being a pagan. And depending on the text, because there are Norse accounts and there are Irish accounts of this battle, Brother should have known better. He received a portent that essentially Brian's army would succeed, but Brian would be killed if they fought on Good Friday. He also received another portent that suggested that if they didn't fight on Good Friday, then Brian would survive, but the Irish would lose. So Brother decided to go ahead and make sure that they would get the victory. He wanted Brian dead. He wanted that final victory if he could. And so Brother decides to fight that battle on Good Friday. Now, the portent is an amazing array of dreams with axes flying and a rain of blood. Well, some texts say it's a dream. In other texts like Njál Saga, they actually describe this as though it's real, that blood rains down on the ship and axes fall out of the sky and knives fall out of the sky. And he has a vision of the Norns, that's the Norse fates, weaving the tapestry of men's lives, not just spinning a thread as in Greek mythology, but weaving a full-on tapestry out of the entrails of men. And the loom itself is comprised of their bones, and the weights are the skulls and heads of dead men, and they're using the bones as the shuttle to weave this tapestry. The Njál Saga is an amazing text, and I promise, again, when we have another episode that deals with the Vikings or with Old Norse Icelandic literature, I'll go into more detail about that one. But the important thing is that there is this whole portentous idea of the battle between the Irish, who are also fighting with their Viking allies, against another Scandinavian army. So they were never quite such clear boundaries. It was never entirely the Irish against the Scandinavians. And in fact, some of the Scandinavians who were Christian fought with Brian specifically because they were Christian. Now, Brother, and this is a nice another aside for Njál Saga, Brother ambushes Brian, which is actually fairly dishonorable. He doesn't meet him full on the field of battle. He ambushes him. And when he ambushes him, he slices off Brian's head. And Brian's grandson, depending on the source, raises his arm to try and protect Brian. And Brother slices his arm off. Well, Brian's blood is so holy that not only does it repair his grandson's arm, it reattaches it, but Brian's head reattaches. Of course, it doesn't bring him back to life, and the head doesn't talk. That's an entirely different genre of hagiography, and there will be an episode on that too. But in this instance, his blood is so sacred and so holy, it at least reattaches his severed head. And of course, the Irish, in vengeance for the murder as they see it, because it was an ambush, it wasn't on the field of battle, the Irish, as they see it, in vengeance for Brother's murder of Brian, when they catch Brother, they eviscerate him. That means they disembowel him. They cut a slit in his abdomen, and they take out his small intestine, and they tie it to a tree. And then they walk him around that tree until he is tied to the tree with his own entrails. And then he's left there to die. Now, of course, that's the account in Njál Saga. As I said, there are Irish accounts, there are Norse accounts, and actually it's actually possible to piece together a clearer picture of the actual events from the literary accounts because there's so many of them and because they're from different perspectives. But all of that is important to the history of medieval Dublin because you have all of those different traditions. You have the syncretic tradition where the Norse polytheistic religion mixes with Irish polytheism, but also Irish Christianity. Because, as I said, Christianity comes to Ireland fairly early, much earlier than it does in England. Now, the Romans were in England, and the Romans Christianized England when the Roman Empire became Christian in 314, as I mentioned in the last episode. But it was St. Augustine in Kent in 597 CE who manages to re-Christianize or bring Christianity back to the largely non-Christian polytheistic Scandinavians who'd settled. The Danes, the Yeots, the Angles, all those people I mentioned last time. Now, in Ireland, that conversion begins before 597. It begins probably about the 5th century, maybe 100 years, maybe even a bit more before that. And the monks who are in Ireland are not in a vacuum either. Even though the Romans, for the most part that we know of, did not actually conquer Ireland. In fact, it's fairly established that the Romans did not set up actual control in Ireland. That doesn't mean there were no Romans in Ireland. It also doesn't mean that there was no contact between Rome and Ireland. In fact, there's archaeological evidence that there was at least trade between Roman Britain and Ireland. So Ireland in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, is a mix of Gael, a mix of Scandinavian, a little bit of Roman thrown in. And of course, there's an awful lot of contact back and forth between England and the continent. Now, as the Middle Ages progress, there's an awful lot more contact and traffic between medieval Dublin and medieval Ireland as a whole and the continent, which I'll talk about in a minute. So after the Battle of Clontarf, there is a period of relative peace and establishment, but it actually starts this sense of conquest. Now you have competing alliances. Now you have a certain competition among these different groups. As such, the city itself had to expand. And so medieval Dublin grows out of just being a long fort, with mostly wooden buildings, a lot of wattle and daub, which means you have rushes and twigs that were woven together and then daubed with mud so that there were no cracks in the walls so you could keep the wind and the rain out. They start building stone. And they start really setting up that settlement in a much more structured way. One of the main points of it, of course, is Christ Church Cathedral. And Christ Church Cathedral is built at the top of that hill. Here's the hill. Down the way, on part of that hill, is Dublin Castle. So the castle isn't built until after the Norman Conquest. The Norman Conquest, I'm sure you've all heard of the Norman Conquest of England in 1066. Well, when the Anglo-Normans set up in England, there's an awful lot of contact still with the Irish. So as a product of this, you then get an awful lot of people in the Angevin court looking over to Ireland for conquest. Now, I mentioned that Christ Church was built originally as part of that wooden Viking settlement. In fact, Christ Church Cathedral has a history spanning more than 1,000 years. Well, nearly 1,000 years. It began as a wooden church founded by the Viking king Sihtric Silkenbeard. That is the same Sihtric Silkenbeard who fought as part of that allied force against the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, because Sihtric Silkenbeard was the Scandinavian or Viking king of Dublin. But after 1014, the Irish won the Battle of Clontarf, but as I said, Brian Boru was killed, and that leads to all kinds of various dynastic machinations. But in 1030, Sihtric Silkenbeard founds the Cathedral of Christ Church. Now, it's not officially a cathedral yet, it's a church, and it will later become a cathedral, which means that it is the seat of a cardinal. But the original building is wooden, and it's built about 1030. Later, once the Normans conquer Ireland, it gets built in stone. Now, of course, that Norman conquest comes after the Norman conquest in England. In 1066, when William the Bastard, as I explained in the last episode, when he comes over and sets up shop in England, he's not really thinking of Ireland. But as his line gets established and his son, Henry the First, and his grandson, Henry the Second, start looking at their own territories and look at expanding, they look to Ireland. Now, before this happens, the Irish, of course, have a very pronounced sense of themselves. In the 11th century, before the Norman Conquest, which takes place about 1169, the Irish monks, the Christians, are busy writing down their own history as they see it. Ireland is a highly literate culture in the early Middle Ages. There are books in Latin. There are books in Middle Irish. And in fact, as Irish monks go over to the continent and take books of their own from Ireland to those monasteries in continental Europe, they sit in the monasteries and they translate Latin texts for themselves, or they write in the margins about how annoyed they are, how cold they are, how bad the food is, how much more motivated their cat is to do his work. Pangerbon, my cat. I mentioned that in the last episode. These manuscripts have glosses in the margins in Old Irish. Now, Old Irish is the earlier form of the language that is written in that Roman script. The earliest form of the Irish language is Ogham, and Ogham is essentially slashes, a specific designated system of slashes and dots that you actually still see in some of those early manuscripts. But at this time, between 1014 and before the Norman conquest of 1169, the Irish are producing all kinds of books. And one of the collections that they produce in both prose and poetic form is the Lever Gavala of Erin. So it's the Lever Gavala Erin. It's an 11th century manuscript that survives in a variety of different pieces and forms. Some are verse, some are prose, some of them backtrack, some of them repeat the same material and add on, some change the material, and those different recensions or different versions and tellings of the same story build this really concrete sense of Irish identity. Now, the term Lever Gavala Erin means the Book of the Takings of Ireland. Some have translated that as the Book of Invasions. And essentially, it records the invasions or takings by 6 peoples in the ancient period leading up to at least the settlement of Dublin around the 7th century. And of course, the Lever Gavala Erin chronicles the resilience of the Irish in the face of loss, violence, displacement, and subjugation throughout a traumatic history. Now, the Lever Gavala was written in Middle Irish before Ireland was conquered by the Norman invaders. And that legendary history of settlement in Ireland is a succession of tragic events that wipe out entire peoples, leaving the island uninhabited until the next wave of settlement, or until the next wave of invaders arrives to conquer and subjugate the people and push them to the west and into the realm of folklore. The different recensions vary in the specific details of these events. As I said, some of them are completely different, some of them are mildly different. But in general, the story begins with a woman named Césaire, or Caesara, who is the daughter of Bith and granddaughter of Noah. Yes, that Noah, the Noah of flood tradition in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible and in the Torah. Now, the whole point of tying one of the original Irish people to Noah is to give it history, to give them credibility, and to essentially anchor the story of the Gaedhil, the Irish people, the Gaels, in a shared past that has its roots in the Bible. Now, remember, Christianity arrives in Ireland earlier. So, this sense of we are part of the same Christian community that goes all the way back to the flood is very important to Irish identity in the early Middle Ages. So, in this story, we get generally Césaire, who leaves Egypt fleeing the flood. In fact, she's like, I'm out of here because the flood's going to wipe everything out. I got to go. In fact, in poem 24, which says that she came from the island of Meroe rather than Egypt, she flees the flood, for she thought it probable that a place where men had never come till then, where no evil nor sin had been committed, and which was free from the reptiles and monsters of the world, that such a place should be exempt from the flood. Not only do they not have snakes, but she thinks, well, because they don't have snakes, they won't have a flood, because it's uncorrupt. She's wrong. After her death and her people from a disease that wipes everybody out in a week, Ireland is uninhabited for 200 years until the flood comes. So the flood comes anyway, and it lasts a year and 40 days. And of course, one of her people, and I love this line from the Lever Gavala, is a man named Ladra, who, quote, died of excess of women, or it is the shaft of the oar that penetrated his buttock. Whatever way it was, however, that Ladra is the first dead man of Ireland. Now there's an epithet, the first dead man of Ireland. But I love the idea that he died either from an excess of women, i.e. he shagged too much, or somebody used the shaft of an oar that penetrated his buttock. That has some interesting connotations. Either way, he dies, and he's considered the first dead man before everybody else dies of disease. Now, after the death of Césaire and her people, after the flood comes, which apparently hits an uninhabited island, according to the Lever Gavala, then Partholon takes Ireland, only to be driven out after 550 years by Cainocephali. Now, the Cainocephali are dog-headed people. And of course, medieval manuscripts are full of images of all kinds of marvelous beings and marvelous peoples, including Cainocephali. In fact, St. Christopher, in earlier traditions, was believed to have the head of a dog, that he was a Cainocephali. And when he carries the Christ child across the river as an act of kindness, and the Christ child gets heavier and heavier, but St. Christopher keeps going, according to tradition, he is transformed after his deed into a human-headed person. Now, the church was a little skeptical about this. We don't really want dog-headed people, even if they transform into fully human. Not sure we want them as saints. So there was a lot of debate about whether St. Christopher should really be a saint or not. And I do believe recently his sainthood was revoked. Poor Christopher, especially since he's the patron saint of travelers. Now, that's a bit of a digression. The Cainocephali apparently are in Ireland somewhere, according to the Lever Gavala, because they wipe out the Partholon. And the Cainocephali kill all of Partholon's people. After that, Nevid shows up 30 years later, and then the Firbolg. And in some accounts, the Firbolg are followed by the Firdomen, the Gaelolan, and then finally, and this is in all of the versions, the Tuatha De Danann. Now, the Tuatha De Danann are considered the people of the goddess Danu. And there's not an awful lot of evidence for Danu other than this, and there's some questions about whether she's really a goddess figure. But the Tuatha De Danann end up pushed to the west. And in some cases, the majority of them, according to the Lever Gavala, are slaughtered by the sons of Mil, the Milesians or the Milesians who come from Spain. Now, the sons of Mil, these Milesians, are actually the Gaedhil. They become the Irish. But in some cases, they have wiped out most, if not all, of the Tuatha Dé Danann. In some cases, they've slaughtered some of the Tuatha Dé Danann and pushed the rest into the west. And of course, the Tuatha Dé Danann become the foundation for Irish stories of the Sidhe. Now, in Irish, a Sidhe is a hill. It is a hill barrow, a burial bower. And of course, the legends develop that the Tuatha Dé Danann pushed into the west, into Tír na nÓg, which is the land of eternal youth, that they are pushed there, and you can get to Tír na nÓg through these barrows, through these hills, these burials. And of course, that's where we get the Banshee, women of the Sidhe. A Sidhe is a hill. It doesn't mean fairy. However, the fae or the fairy, as they evolve in Irish tradition and in certain mythological and folkloric traditions, comes from that idea of the Tuatha Dé Danann pushed to the west, who are also then in some cases pushed into those burial barrows or living in the hills. They are essentially the people of the hills. Now, all of that is wrapped up in actual literary texts of the Middle Ages, folklore, legends, and a certain sense of mythology, because people like the Tuatha Dé Danann actually form parts of the religious ideologies of the non-Christian Irish in the early Middle Ages. But all of this is in the Leabhar Gabhála. All of this is written down in this 11th century compilation text. So, once you have the Gaedhil, once the sons of Mil have taken over, once the sons of Mil have actually settled as the Gaedhil, pushed everybody away, wiped everybody out, then they set up. And as I said, the first settlement of Dublin is Gaedhil. It's the Gaels in the 7th century. So what the 11th century Leabhar Gabhála Éireann does is it traces this history, this legendary past of the Irish people, and it grounds it and roots it in the shared European Christian tradition all the way back to the Bible. And of course, there are places where they align with Troy. Because of course, as I said in the last episode, in the 12th century, there's this huge push to create an identity and an origin story based in stories of Troy and the fall of Troy. That's in the Leabhar Gabhála na Éireann too. But the whole point is the Leabhar Gabhála said, Troy, hold my beer. We're going to go all the way back to the Bible. And that's what they did. Now, back to Christ Church. The building of Christ Church, even though it was originally founded as a wooden structure in about 1030, when the Normans essentially conquer, a lot less violent, sort of, than the conquest of England, then they start establishing themselves by building things in stone. Now, the Normans did the same thing in England. When William I shows up after the Battle of Hastings, he builds castles. The first castles in England appear in conjunction with William. And in a later episode, I hope to have castle experts on who will explain that whole process of building and developing stone castles. The same thing happens when the Normans from England come in and conquer Ireland. Now, the way that happens is essentially part of these alliances, where the King of Leinster works an alliance with the Norman knight Strongbow and promises his daughter Aoife to Strongbow in marriage. Now, I'm sure that that marital alliance was not all sweetness and light. A lot of 19th century art portrays it as this idyllic, diplomatic, romantic union between Norman and Irish. Yeah, probably not. Marital alliances were big business. Marital alliances in the Middle Ages were very important. But an important thing to dispel here is the idea that women would have automatically been married off in an alliance against their will. That is not the case. And in fact, in most marital alliances, the woman had to not only be willing, but she had to be an active participant in the negotiations in order to keep whatever treaty was agreed in place. And of course, when we get to the episode on Beowulf, we'll see that not only were women peace weavers, they were also absolutely willing to wage war. Now, the reason that I'm using Christ Church as kind of the focal point here is because it really is the anchor of the city of medieval Dublin. And it was such a big church that by 1152, it was incorporated into the full Irish church. And within a decade after that, the Archbishop Lawrence O'Toole had been appointed at Christ Church. Now, Lawrence O'Toole, or Lorcan O'Toole, is actually a very important figure in the entire process of the Norman Conquest, because Lorcan O'Toole, in English, the anglicized version is Lawrence O'Toole, and in French, it's Laurent II, because he was both in Ireland and he was in France, and he went back and forth. And in fact, Lorcan, before he ever ascended to that vaunted position of archbishop, is very important because he is related to the King of Leinster. Now, Ireland's provinces had kings, and Leinster is the province that includes Dublin. In 1166, Lawrence, or Lorcan's brother-in-law, Diarmaid, was deposed as King of Leinster by an alliance of Irish kings and princes led by High King Rory O'Crover. Now, Diarmaid, King of Leinster, deposed in a bit of shambles. He's exiled. And Henry II of England, who himself noted for a certain number of ruthless things and an entire history of dodgy stuff that we'll talk about in another episode. Henry II is one of my favorites. Actually, it's his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is more my favorite. Henry II kind of said he'd help Diarmaid out because, of course, he saw an opportunity. The opportunity here was infighting among the various Irish kings and princes, because each province has a king. There's a High King of Ireland, but Henry II really is not in the mood to allow the Irish kings enough power, combined power, to be a threat to him or a threat to anything else. So Diarmaid, since he's exiled, has a few promises of help from King Henry II. And he goes through Wales and England and France, and he comes back with kind of a group, not so much of mercenaries, but a group of Normans and Flemish and Welsh allies who essentially need to make some money. This is an opportunity for them. They're not really mercenaries because they're not being paid to fight. But they're hoping that with these alliances, that if they can bolster their own social position, that they will be able to get higher and higher status within the Irish royal hierarchy. So essentially, they decide to attack Dublin. And it is an Irish walled city. The Hiberno-Norse citizens are terrified by these knights and these men-at-arms who are Norman. And of course, just like everybody now gets stories of the Vikings as brutal and vicious, these are Hiberno-Norse citizens of Dublin. These are the Irish and Scandinavian, and sometimes a mix of the two, citizens of the walled city of Dublin who have heard the stories of the Norman brutality. Now, Diarmaid was King of Leinster. He's Irish, but he's brought with him all of these bands of Normans and Flemish, and they probably look like a bit of a scary group. But Diarmaid's also hoping that those reputation would precede them, that the stories of the vicious slaughter and the brutality of the Normans would help him take Dublin. And it does. Now, his brother-in-law, Lorcan O'Toole, or Lawrence O'Toole, is besieged by people imploring him to save them and to make a treaty with those Anglo-Normans, because the Hiberno-Norse residents of Dublin really don't want a siege. They don't want to be slaughtered in their beds, but they also don't want to be starved out in the process of a siege. So the Archbishop goes out. And of course, in fairness, again, Diarmait's his brother-in-law. So it's not like he doesn't know these people. But he goes out and manages to actually arrange a treaty. They're supposed to make a treaty. This is the point. He's there to appeal to them. But while he's outside the city walls, two Norman knights get into the city. They burn houses. They kill unarmed civilians. And Lawrence hears about this. He gets back to Dublin and he stops the slaughter. Now, this is part of why Lawrence becomes a saint. And this is an important point, because in the early Christian period, the historical saints are people who were tortured in a variety of horrible ways, usually because they refused to give up their Christian faith. In fact, among hagiography, female saints, virgin female saints, are tortured in the worst possible ways. The idea of being tortured, healed, and then beheaded, that's what happens to a lot of female saints. But with certain historical figures that we know these people existed, their sanctity comes from their ability to either fight valiantly for their people, fight valiantly for their faith, do good and pious things and then work a few miracles, or in the case of St. Lawrence O'Toole, he manages to stop the slaughter of the Dublin civilians at the hands of the Normans and orchestrate, essentially, a treaty. Again, Diarmait, who's in control of all of this, he is successful, and he's reinstated as King of Leinster, as well as King of the Hiberno-Norse city-states of Wexford and Waterford and Dublin. And essentially, he gets even more power than he had before. To seal the alliance and to solidify his own victory and his own control over all of these territories, he offers his daughter Aoife, who's also St. Lawrence O'Toole's niece, in a dynastic marriage alliance to the leader of the Normans, Strongbow. Now, whether Strongbow is one of those Norman knights who got into the city of Dublin and slaughtered people, we don't know. It's possible. But Strongbow was a quintessential Norman knight. And in fact, once he marries Aoife, they set up a lasting dynasty and alliance between the Irish and the Normans. Now, at some point in time after that, Lawrence leaves Ireland. He goes to France. He goes on a pilgrimage, and he establishes himself in Eu. But of course, he's also been bishop in Glendalough, and he's been Archbishop of Dublin, and he dies on the continent. And in good hagiographical tradition, his body is, shall we say, separated, because his skull was reportedly brought to England in 1442, and it is established at the parish church of Corley, which is also called St. Lawrence's. But that's okay. Eu has their own. I mean, in Eu, in France, there is a reliquary that supposedly has his skull. But though, of course, supposedly his skull was brought to England. Hagiography doesn't really care if these things contradict themselves. I believe in the first episode, I did mention that there are at least 3 churches in France that claim to have the head of John the Baptist. So unless he had 3 heads, some of those skulls are perhaps not real. Not that anybody cares. But in the case of Lawrence O'Toole, he'd been Archbishop, he'd been a bishop, he had a great tie to Ireland. He's the brother-in-law of the King of Leinster. But his claim to fame, and in fact his sanctity, comes from his ability to wage peace. And not only is his skull in the continent and his bones are in the continent, but supposedly, by tradition, he wanted his heart brought back to Dublin. And of course, his heart is in a reliquary. Now, reliquaries are usually very fancy, very decorated objects. You can see in some of the videos that I have here from the National Museum, reliquaries are decorated with silver and gold and gemstones. And in some cases, the relics themselves are long lost. But what's important is the reliquary. They're casks of all of these gorgeous, gorgeous enameled images. And I say casks, they're small boxes. Caskets, as you were, caskets that contain some part of the saint, maybe their cloth, maybe some of their clothes, maybe something dipped in their blood if they were martyred. And in most cases, those reliquaries are very, very valuable, as valuable as the things within them. Now, the reliquary for St. Lawrence O'Toole, since it's his heart, is shaped like a heart. It's just a very big one. And that heart reliquary, for centuries, was chained to the wall of Christ Church Cathedral. The huge reliquary itself, bound in iron, was chained to the wall and encased in a cage, basically. Well, in 2012, some little arseholes decided to steal it. Not 100% certain why, unless, of course, they just decided that, hey, look, we stole the heart of St. Lawrence O'Toole. Might have been a dare. It might have been drunk. It's possible. We don't know. The reliquary itself is not very fancy. The reliquary itself is not covered in gems. It's not enameled. It's not one of the most beautiful objects ever. But it is very cool. And all they did was clip that cage and then clip the chain, and they stole the heart reliquary. Now, it's entirely possible that they realized stealing the heart of the patron saint of Dublin is a bad idea and brings you nothing but bad luck. And it was recovered in 2018 in Phoenix Park, which is a very big, famous park in Dublin. And of course, it was an anonymous tip. And basically they said, right, the heart of St. Lawrence O'Toole, it's in Phoenix Park, go find it. And it was called into the Garda Síochána, and the guards went and found it. And it was intact. There's no evidence that I know of that anybody tried to force it open. I'm not sure that they could have. It looks like an actual solid entity, as you can see from the images. But of course, supposedly, according to the newspapers, the thieves thought that the heart was cursed. That's fair. Like I said, you steal the heart of the patron saint of Dublin, don't expect it to bring you any luck. So Christ Church Cathedral, which became the resting place for Lawrence O'Toole's heart, is at the heart of Dublin itself. The stone building was created and consecrated after Strongbow. In fact, Strongbow is buried there. His sarcophagus hangs out on one of the aisles on the side of the nave. And of course, this is the main seat of most religious devotion inside the city of Dublin. And I say inside because Christ Church Cathedral is within the city walls. Outside the city walls, just down the street, is St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, St. Patrick's Cathedral was also founded at least in the 12th century, but the current building survives from about 1220 to 1259. So it's a very different style, even though those two cathedrals were built within a few years of each other. Of course, after the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, which nobody likes, particularly not in Ireland, after the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536, those cathedrals, both St. Patrick's and Christ Church, fall under the auspices of the Church of England. Henry's just made himself head of the church. All the cathedrals belong to him. And as such, both Christ Church and St. Patrick's ceased to be Catholic cathedrals. Now, they fall into a certain amount of disrepair, partly because of this, and partly because of economic crises throughout the 18th centuries. And in the 19th centuries, both Christ Church and St. Patrick's are renovated. Now, of course, Christ Church, at the top of the hill and being not far from the Jameson's distillery, that's Jameson's Irish whiskey, Christ Church was renovated from a generous grant at the expense of Henry Rowe, Jameson's, who gave £230,000, which is 35 million euro today, to renovate the cathedral and to save it from ruin. At the same time, within a few years of each other at least, St. Patrick's is renovated by the Guinness family, because the Guinness brewery is down in that part of Dublin in what's called the Liberties. And the Liberties, of course, refers to the area within the bells of St. Patrick's. So Guinness's restores St. Patrick's, and Jameson's restores Christ Church. And in fact, the original city walls of Dublin, you can still see them today. You'd think it's a rather large area, but it really isn't. And within the same walls, you have Christ Church Cathedral, and behind it is the ugly corporation building that was built on top of the Viking settlement of Wood Quay. And then, of course, a little off to the west is the parish church of St. Audun's. Now, St. Audun's, I didn't get a chance to go visit this time when I was in Dublin, but St. Audun's is the oldest surviving parish church in Dublin. And it's one of those original medieval churches. Though Dublin had lots of parish churches, there is a model in Dublinia, which is an exceptionally interesting exhibit on medieval Dublin. It tells you all about the history. It tells you all about the foundation. It's kind of interactive, and it's got some really cool stuff in it. And all of that in Dublinia tells you that story of Christ Church. It tells you the story of the Vikings. But it points out in this amazing model that there are so many parish churches in Dublin. Now, some of those parish churches exist, but they exist in a later form than they did originally. St. Audun's is, in fact, the oldest surviving medieval parish church, and it's just across the street from the oldest pub in Dublin, the Brazen Head pub, which was founded in 1198. Now, again, I'm sorry I did not make it to the Brazen Head. It's a fantastically cool building, and they're always good for a session and kale and crack. You know, you have music, you've got good times, good food, and good fun, and it's just a really cool pub. Now, it's called the Brazen Head, allegedly, because supposedly during the siege of Dublin. Now, that doesn't quite work, because 1198, that's about, quick, do math. Well, if the Norman invasion was 1170, this is about 18 years later or so, give or take. Supposedly 1198, the Brazen Head pub is founded. And it's called the Brazen Head because supposedly during that Norman Conquest of Dublin a number of years before, in 1170, 1169, somebody stuck their head out over the parapets in order to see what the siege lines looked like. So allegedly, the Brazen Head is a woman who stuck her head out. Some versions it's a man, but supposedly somebody very brazenly stuck their head out over the city wall to check and see what the conditions were of the siege, and risked potentially losing their head or simply being killed through arrows, onslaughts, variety of things. So the pub is called the Brazen Head because of that apocryphal story. Now, that's the oldest pub in Dublin. As you go down along the quayside in Dublin, you can either go by the river or you can go back up to Christ Church. If you go down Christ Church, down the hill, like I said, Dublin Castle is on your right. Dublin Castle, of course, is still an administrative seat in Dublin today, but it was also the seat of British rule in Ireland for centuries. And as such, the castle inhabitants were associated with English rule, and it was part of the fraught history of Ireland, which I will talk about in another episode, for centuries. The original buildings of Dublin Castle, of course, were built at the time of the Normans, because that's what the Normans did. The Normans built castles, and they built a castle and fortified that stone wall around the city of Dublin. There is, of course, the second ugliest building in Dublin, and that's the Corporation building inside the castle walls. And that's really it. It's just a tongue-in-cheek way of saying they built a massive, big, modern building in the middle of a medieval castle. And of course, it is still part of the working government. But if you go past Dublin Castle and you get into some of the streets and side streets, that's where you find some of the traditional pubs, like the Stag's Head in Dame Lane, which was my stomping grounds when I was at university. And then, of course, as you get closer towards Temple Bar, which is on the left, which is now is full of amazing pubs and restaurants, and it's right there on the side of the Liffey. And at the far end of Temple Bar is a pub called the Palace, and it's right before you cross over the O'Connell Street Bridge to the north side. Now, there's a whole host of medieval history on the north side too, but a lot of that is later, because really, during the Middle Ages, Dublin was contained within those medieval city walls, the top of which is Christ Church, and then you have in the corner for defense Dublin Castle, and you have all of those parish churches, all of the towns, all of the tradesmen, all of the merchants, all of that is contained within the city walls. And the wall, of course, is open at the river because the river is its natural boundary. They also needed to preserve that traditional port. Now, at the very bottom of Dame Street, straight down from Christ Church, and it's a bit of a wobble, is Trinity College Dublin. Trinity College Dublin was founded by a charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1592. And it is a completely self-contained university. It can close its gates and you're not getting in. There's only one way in, one way out when they close all of the gates around the school. It is essentially a walled city of its own. It has its own laws, its own charters. It is subject to the laws of Dublin, absolutely, but it still has its own charter. In fact, when I graduated and walked in procession from the Provost's house to the exam hall in November of 2000, when I received my PhD, we followed the mace, but we also followed the original copy of the Elizabethan Charter. Now, of course, Trinity College occupies a very central location on the south side of Dublin. Currently, the Luas, which is the light rail, goes in front of it on both sides. And they've essentially closed a lot of that area to traffic unless you're a taxi, which is quite nice, actually, for those of us who are returning to the city for the first time in decades, because there's an awful lot less traffic, full stop. But Trinity itself is steeped in history. When you go through the front gate, and you're in Front Square, full of cobblestones, and you see the campanile, the bell tower of Trinity in front of you. And behind it is the red brick building, the Rubrics, the oldest building at Trinity. And on the right is the long library, the long hall, that beautiful and very famous library. Now, I walked through that library every day on my way to the manuscripts reading room. I have a deep affinity for that place in my heart. It's being renovated now. And of course, they are kind of revising it because that's where the Book of Kells lives. The Book of Kells is, of course, the gospel that was written about 800 CE. It's found in a bog, as you do. And in fact, we're going to have a whole discussion about bogs and bog bodies in our next episode when we talk to Dr. Vicky McAllister, who is a castle archaeologist and historian. She does digital mapping of castle archaeology. She has the coolest stuff, and we will be talking to her for the next episode. But we'll have a bit of a discussion of bog bodies. Also, in another episode, we're going to have Dr. Wendy Turner specifically talking about corpses and cadavers, bog bodies, and other important things to do with dead people in the Middle Ages, not just in Dublin. Those are other episodes that are coming up. But the Book of Kells is a central feature of tourism at Trinity College Dublin because it is an extraordinary example of medieval manuscripts. We'll also have another episode coming up on medieval manuscripts. And I have some videos of Dr. Charlene Eska, who's a world-known philologist and expert in a variety of medieval languages, but particularly Old Irish and Middle Irish. And we will be walking through the collections at the National Museum in Ireland. That is full of amazing stuff and amazing stories. So I hope this episode, where I've been able to share a little bit of medieval Dublin with you, has at least whetted your appetite and has interested you in learning more about both medieval Dublin, medieval Ireland, and the Middle Ages as a whole. And I would like to thank you very much for tuning in for this episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.